For 16 years, he seemed to be untouchable, a politician who not only shaped Hungary, but also repeatedly slowed down the European Union. With vetoes, blockades, and a foreign policy stance that visibly brought him closer to Russia. But this very era has now come to an end. Something has shifted in Hungary, and with a force that many had not expected. On Sunday evening, tens of thousands of people gathered along the Danube in Budapest. They celebrated, danced, and sang, while fireworks lit up the sky above them. And it was clearly noticeable that what was finding expression here was more than just joy over an election result. After a record voter turnout in Hungary and a victory for the opposition, people celebrated the new winner. Many chanted slogans against Russia's influence. Some shouted, "Russians, go home." And the same sentence was heard again and again. After 16 years, the country finally needs change. And this exact feeling was also reflected in the result. The conservative opposition party not only won the election, but also achieved a 2/3 majority in parliament, with over 53% of the votes. 138 out of 199 seats, which had special significance in Hungary, because this majority allowed for profound political and even constitutional changes. This very tool had been used for years by the previous government to reshape the system according to their ideas. Now this power was in the hands of the other side. At the center of this political upheaval was Péter Magyar, a 45-year-old politician who had played hardly any role until recently, and now suddenly was able to govern with enormous support. During the election campaign, he had announced a clear pro-European stance, wanted to strengthen relations with the EU, create more distance from Russia, and at the same time fight corruption in his own country. So exactly the opposite of what the previous government did. In his victory speech, he made it clear that he was not aiming for a simple change of government, but for a fundamental political break, when he stated that those who had exploited the country would no longer get away without consequences. That was a clear message to the old government, because for Viktor Orban, this election meant the end of a long political dominance that had had an impact far beyond Hungary. For over 16 years, he had built a system that was often described as an illiberal democracy, an order in which democratic procedures formally remained, but power was strongly concentrated. Within the European Union, he repeatedly positioned himself as a troublesome actor, especially when it came to foreign policy decisions that required unanimity. At exactly this point, the election became especially important for Europe, especially when it came to supporting Ukraine, imposing sanctions against Russia, or providing financial aid packages. Time and again, a single country was enough to block joint decisions, and often that country was Hungary. And, with an election victory for the other side, that is likely to change. The European Union will probably have more leeway, be able to act more quickly, present a more united front, and implement decisions that had previously been stuck for months. And that's exactly why this election was closely watched in Moscow, because for Putin, Orban's loss of power means a significant setback. After Russia lost Syria and Venezuela as important partners, it is now also losing a puppet in Europe. This change of power therefore also has very concrete effects on the war in Ukraine, because under Orban, Hungary repeatedly played a key role in slowing down, or at least delaying, European support. Time and again, aid packages, sanctions, or joint decisions got stuck in Budapest, or only passed in a weakened form because Orban tied his approval to political or economic demands, from which he probably also benefited personally. With a victory by Magyar, that exact situation would change. In Brussels, the expectation arose that blocked aid for Ukraine could be released more quickly in the future, and that decisions would no longer fail because of a single veto. There were also positive signals in Kiev, as people there are hoping for a much more constructive cooperation, especially when it comes to military and financial support. For Russia, this means, conversely, that an important lever within the European Union is lost. Until now, Moscow had indirectly benefited from European decisions being delayed or watered down. Without this influence, the pressure on Russia could increase, not necessarily through new measures alone, but especially through faster and more consistent implementation of existing policies. This means that not only does the political dynamic within the EU shift, but also, to some extent, the strategic balance in the background of the war in Ukraine. Nevertheless, the situation is still complex. Even without Orban, the European Union wouldn't instantly unite, even though internal tensions within Europe persist, whether in dealing with other geopolitical conflicts or with fundamental issues like the enlargement of the EU. But a central blocking factor, which had repeatedly caused stagnation over the years, has at least for now disappeared. So what began as a celebration in Budapest yesterday could turn out to be a political turning point for all of Europe. Not just because a government had been voted out, but also because this changed the dynamics within the EU and even indirectly influenced the situation in the Ukraine war. Because if Europe can make decisions more quickly without being blocked, can act more decisively without being blocked, and can also push through measures that are not in Russia's interest without being blocked, then that has a direct impact on how support is organized and how strong the pressure on Russia actually is. And that's exactly why, in the end, this election was much more than just a domestic political event in Hungary. Even though many parties wanted to influence this election in their favor, it must also be said at this point, the EU naturally tried to influence the election so that its interests would be at the forefront. So of course they influenced their favorite. Russia influenced the other side, meaning Orban, just like many other countries did as well. We also saw that J.D. Vance from the USA came by as well, so the vice president of a country, to publicly, right before an election, align himself with Orban. And at this point, I'll leave you with a question. Do you think it was a wise decision on the part of the USA, so shortly before election night, in the midst of the current geopolitical conflicts, to publicly stand on stage with Orban and present him as a favorite? Or do you think that Orban might have gotten a better election result if they hadn't done that? Of course, it could also be completely trivial. We can see that people have been taking to the streets for years. They are protesting against the current or the previous regime by now. And we can also see that here on Election Day with a really high turnout of voters. And I'll leave you with that question. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to all subscribers, channel members, Alja Cruz, and especially Lieutenant Colonel Rennecke, Silla, Dietrich, and Ferdinand Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next Situation Report.